Good morning. Just the fact that you're here, to me, fills me with optimism. I'm really excited, and I appreciate folks coming in, particularly some of you traveling from across state lines last night, heavy storms. Hopefully you had safe travels. But the fact that you're here, I think the energy in the room, and then the afternoon session today, I think speaks volumes to the shared commitment we all have, both to productive working lands, but then also to productive working lakes and the recreational opportunities and the clean water that the lakes and the Great Lakes region provide for the citizens of Ohio and Michigan and Indiana. So I'm here today to talk about two important releases, two announcements. But before I get into the nitty-gritty, if there's nothing else you hear from me today, it's this, is that NRCS alone cannot do this. The only way we're going to accomplish our production goals, to have the abundant food and fiber we need for a growing world population, but also to have the clean water we need for a growing urban America, and provide for the multiple use of the industries across the basin, is if you have the collaborative represented in this room working together to address these challenges. It's private landowners working in cooperation with soil water conservation districts. It's soil water conservation districts working with private NGOs like the Nature Conservancy represented here today, and a host of other organizations. It's agribusiness bringing their professionalism, expertise, their boots on the ground know-how to work with those landowners. It's cities and counties working with their water utilities, working in partnership to protect source water. It's NGOs and other advocates advocating for the protections and the resources needed to do this work on the ground. It's universities and researchers coming in, helping devise the cutting-edge tools and technologies to help target conservation where it's most needed, but also then to hold us accountable and assess what's actually happening in the water. It's all this coming together, leveraging our expertise, our know-how, our resources to make a difference for agriculture, because we have to have agriculture. It's a part of the economy, it's part of the communities, and it's what we need to provide for the food we need as a growing world civilization. But then we also need to protect these natural resources for the long-term quality of life here in Ohio and in the Great Lakes region. So there are two announcements we're going to be making today. We're making right now. The first is a release of a special study. So NRCS, working with our partners at the Agricultural Research Service, have invested in a long-term study across the United States in trying to assess what's happening on croplands in America. We did this assessment back in the mid-2000s. We went out and surveilled row crop, cultivated cropland across the United States from 2003 to 2006, and we got a snapshot of what was happening. What's the land management? What's the land use across America? We overlay that land management know-how, that we actually get the actual farm records, production records from producers, keep that proprietary, very private and confidential, but we take that actual farm data and information, and we overlay the land management on top of all the ecological characteristics which we know about. So NRCS, we've mapped the soils across the entire continent. We have the soil profiles. We know the soil characteristics across the United States. We have the other ecological attributes, the weather, the climate, the topography. So we overlay all the management on top of the ecological characteristics. And from that, then we can model and assess what's happening. When you manage these cultivated croplands differently, what are the losses coming off the field for sediment, for nitrogen, for phosphorus? So we went back in 2012, and what we're announcing today is the release of the update. So it's the 2012 update. In this case, we just focused on the Western Lake Erie Basin. So this is an in-depth analysis and drill down into what's been happening on cultivated croplands here in the Western Lake Erie Basin during 2012. And so then we can compare back to the previous study we did in the mid-2000s, but also then assess what is happening in the basin to help us devise a better approach to address both production goals, but also water quality protection goals here in the Western Lake Erie Basin. The second part I'm going to talk about after the first is an announcement on the Western Lake Erie Basin Initiative. We're NRCS, and we want to leverage our investments with our private sector, our public sector partners across the basin to get more boots on the ground, to provide more voluntary, collaborative conservation assistance with farmers, to get more on-the-ground investments, both provide for healthier soils, more productive soils, provide that food and fiber we need, but critically also then protect the water flowing off these farm fields, ultimately ending up here in Lake Erie. So let me first unpack this special study we did, the Western Lake Erie Basin study. So this is the program we call this, for those taking notes, it's called the Conservation Effects Assessment Project, CEAP, SEEP. A federal appointee, we like to have acronyms. That's one thing we do. So SEEP goes in, and what we do in the Western Lake Erie Basin, we actually surveyed over 1,000 farmers here in the basin. And we got from them very in-depth, detailed looks at how they're managing their soils, what are their tillage systems, their planting decisions, their crop rotations. We looked at their fertilizer applications, how they're managing the manures, how they're managing their, in some cases, the residue they leave on the soils, their different soil management, soil erosion protection practices, the nutrient management practices, their pest management practices. So we get all that information, and then we overlay that over, as I said, the soils information, and we statistically then extrapolate out what's happening. So it's statistically valid at the basin scale. We cannot drill down into sub-basins. We don't have the statistical power to do that. But we can very scientifically and confidently talk about what is happening across cultivated cropland across the whole basin. So the basin, as you know, is over 7 million acres, over 11,000 square miles in size. Within that, about 4.9 million acres are cultivated cropland. So we're going to be talking about just those 4.9 million acres of cultivated crop. So there's some really positive news, and there's also then, within this, there's additional needs, additional opportunities to address on-field conservation needs. The positive news. We went out and looked across those 4.9 million acres, 99% of cultivated crop acres in the Western Lake Erie Basin have at least one conservation practice in place. 99% of all cropland in the basin have at least one conservation practice in place. To me, what this shows is that there's incredible interest and support from the agriculture community to voluntarily put in place conservation practices to address their soil and their water quality needs. Now, it's not sufficient. I'm not saying every acre has been treated to the maximum extent. In a lot of cases, what are needed in these crop fields are systems of practices working together. So it may be your tillage practices overlaid with your residue management to protect those soils, maybe incorporating a cover crop to keep the soils protected when you don't have the crash crop in place. It may be buffers at the edge of the field to prevent edge of field loss. It may be different drainage water management technologies and systems to treat the tile lines that are coming out and helping to drain, make those fields tillable, arable. It's the nutrient management practices that are in place. They all need to work together as a system and as a concert. A lot of producers are very far along in that path, but some are just beginning that path. So we'll get to what's needed here. We need to talk about a couple other very positive things. So if you look at the change from 2003, 2006, mid-2000s to 2012, the conservation, the additional conservation that farmers have put in place have helped reduce sediment loss, edge of field loss of sediment, by almost half. So the additional investments that farmers put in place over the following decade cut in half the amount of sediment loss. They also help reduce, because a lot of that sediment is, carries phosphorus as part of that sediment loss, reduced total phosphorus losses by almost 18%, additional from the mid-2000s. So they're making good progress. If you look at, though, if you strip out in a hypothetical world, if you actually pulled out all conservation, so you had the cultivation, you had the production in place. If you hypothetically pulled out that 99% of conservation, you just had agriculture producing without those good practices in place. And you overlay then what is conservation doing? So you have the hypothetical scenario, no conservation, with the actual what's in field today. Farmers have reduced edge of field losses of sediment by over 81%. From a no practice scenario. Huge reductions in potential loss of sedimentation. In terms of nitrogen loss, total nitrogen loss, they've cut nitrogen by 36% from a no practice scenario. And total phosphorus, again, surface loss and subsurface loss of total phosphorus of 75%. So the conservation systems are a good upfront investment. They're doing a good job, initial job, but then what the SEEP report is going to talk about, there's some opportunities to go further. So there's great progress, a lot of great benefits are being delivered, but it's not sufficient and we have a ways to go. So for example, about 40%, 42% of the acres in the basin are responsible, contributing to upwards of 78% of total phosphorus loss, the remaining phosphorus. And those 42% are also responsible for the 80% of the sediment loss. So it talks about that within the basin, while the majority are doing a really good job in terms of managing their soils, managing their operations, there's still then the few, somewhat the 80-20 rule, there's still then some crop fields where we have opportunities to make targeted investments to help those producers take their level of stewardship to the next level, to help them be productive, keep those lands producing what we need, keep those rural economies vibrant, but importantly then do an even better job of protecting those, the surface flow and subsurface loss of nutrients. What the SEEP report will also talk about is that then we've really, over the last decade, last 2 decades, agriculture and the conservation community have really addressed a large scale across the whole basin the needs at a macro scale. So in terms of targeting, what we're really going to have to get down to, not necessarily targeting within sub-watersheds, sub-components of the basin, we now need to get down to and target within a field of a farm. We're having to take the precision conservation approach to stewardship of our soil resources and water resources. So it's within fields, these farm fields, as many of you know, they're not just a single soil type within a field. There's a lot of different soil profiles within an individual field. And these fields overall are pretty productive, but you may have a small inclusion, a small parcel within the overall field itself, which may have a sandy loam soil, which will really serve then as the sink that will then draw that surface water into the subsurface system, pulling the phosphorus, the nutrients into that water table system. The farmer may not know about the risk profile of his different soils, so that's where we have to now get, as a conservation community, NRCS in particular, but then also our conservation partners in the districts and the agribusiness community, help farmers target within fields the level of management where maybe there may be corners of fields where you just don't plant at all. Because no matter what you do, you're never going to get your return on your investment. Your inputs you're putting in there, your seeds, your fuel costs, your fertilizer costs, the yield is never going to match because it's going to be a poor soil and you're frankly wasting your inputs, you're wasting your money trying to farm that. Maybe there's some opportunities to look at other conservation uses for that field. Or it's about precision application. Maybe you don't need to. If you're doing good soil tests and precision application of your nutrients, you can actually throttle back, cut back on your application because the soils already have the necessary nutrients in there to support the cash crop. So again, you're not wasting your money, helps optimize your inputs of fertilizer, overall saving that farm money, saving your overall fertilizer bill, but then preventing additional edge of field losses. So what we're talking about ultimately is taking the level of stewardship to a higher level. And it's going to be difficult to do. This is not something we're going to get to quickly or fast. If you look at what farmers are doing in the Western Lake Erie Basin, their level of nutrient management is actually at a very high level. If you compare them against only any other basin in the country, the level of stewardship here in the Western Lake Erie Basin is at a very high level. So on average, farmers are losing between 1 to 2 pounds of phosphorus per year, per acre. So if you think about how much is a pound of phosphorus, you can hold it in your hand. And you spread those little granules of phosphorus across an acre, you'd be challenged to find one little granule of phosphorus in an entire acre. And we're now asking farmers to help dial that back an additional 40, 50%. So to be able to get to that level of efficiency is going to be technologically a real challenge, but also from an ag production management, it's also going to be a real challenge. We can do it, and farmers in the basin are doing it. This is something that is achievable, but it's going to take a lot of resources, a lot of expertise and know-how, and a lot of partnership to get these resources out in the fields, in the hands of farmers, helping them experiment with different systems, so ultimately we can tailor conservation systems that work for their operations. So let me then shift to the initiative part. And that's where we're going to be investing. But to be clear, this is not an NRCS only investment. What we hope this is to be is really a catalyst. We really help spark and encourage additional leveraging from our conservation partners, from state agencies, from the agribusiness community, from commodity associations, from farmers themselves. So what we're committing to today, so from fiscal year 16 through fiscal years 18, so through the life of this farm bill, the National Federal Farm Bill that provides our agency these financial and technical resources to do this kind of work, we're committing over the next 3 years an additional $30 million coming in the Western Lake Erie Basin from national resources. So we're expanding the additionality, the additional resources coming in the basin. The total initiative itself is going to be $41 million. Of EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which is our main financial assistance program to go out and do this kind of practices we're talking about with farmers. So it's $41 million over 3 years, coming to just the Western Lake Erie Basin. And then we're also complementing that. So the initiative itself is $41 million. Complementing that, we're also going to be counting the other resources, the general financial assistance that's going to be coming into the basin. So the initiative is going to be very focused on a four-pronged strategy approach to helping to target. We're going to be targeting these resources to the best of our ability, as I talked about, more at a within farm field targeting. So really then the NRCS has come together working, and many of the partners in this room helping identify and then using the science of the SEEP report I talked about, identify what are those core practices, the most effective practices that we need to put in place. And they're aligned across these 4 strategies. So it's to avoid, control, trap, and then manage. So we're talking about avoiding over-application, excess application of nutrients. It's about controlling the nutrients and sediments in your field, so you're not having movement through erosion, through rainfall events like we had last night. It's about, if there are big rainstorm events, it's trapping at edge of field those nutrients and sediments. And then the 4th is manage. It's to manage the hydrologic pathways. It's, as you know, over 87%, almost 90% of the Western Lake Erie Basin croplands are tile lined to allow for management of these farm fields for production purposes. It's about looking at how do you manage these tile systems so you can treat the water before the water leaves the farm. And there's different technologies and practices we have that can ultimately reduce the nutrient load, the phosphate and nitrate loads in those tile lines, so that when ultimately the water leaves the tile line, enters into the flood control ditch or into the surface systems, that ultimately that tile line water is going to be cleaner and have less suspended phosphorus and nitrates in that water column. So it's avoid, control, trap, and manage. So we've identified core practices across these 4 strategies in the help using the SEEP science, listening to our partners here in the basin, and then so we're going to be using these $41 million to target that 4-pronged strategy. In addition to that, we're also going to be counting of the overall effort here an additional $36 million. These are going to be general financial assistance to the basin. It could be things like a nutrient management plan. It could be experimentation with cover crops. It could be helping with better manure management or manure storage. It could be putting in exclusion fencing to exclude out livestock from surface creeks and tributaries. Different practices, all complementary, all helping to protect water quality here in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So in total, between the initiative and these other general resources, NRCS, we estimate just through an environmental quality incentives program, a total of $77 million to the Western Lake Erie Basin just in the next 3 years. That's not including our easement programs. We have a stewardship program. We have conservation technical assistance, which provides for conservation planning, which is going to be instrumental to this. But if we look at just the $77 million, again, using the SEEP model, using our technology, we estimate that that's going to be, we hope to be able to treat over the next 3 years 870,000 acres of cropland in the basin. That's about 18% of the basin, which is a pretty good kickstart here to really expand upon the great investments that are already in place. And we estimate then, in terms of the performance, we will be able to reduce edge of field losses of phosphorus, total phosphorus, by 640,000 pounds annually. That's total phosphorus. I think the soluble phosphorus is about 175,000 pounds, Lee, of soluble phosphorus, which I know a lot of folks are very concerned about and ultimately is contributing to the concerns here in Lake Erie. So if anything, this underscores NRCS, the federal resources alone will not fix it. But we think this is a great jumpstart, will really be a catalyst, put a lot of additional resources in the field to help production agriculture contribute to really positive solutions here in the basin, but crucially keep production agriculture successful, because ultimately it's what we need for the economies of the area and frankly ultimately for the water quality of Lake Erie. In other basins in the country, USDA EPA has been on the record saying, like in the Chesapeake Bay, the best thing for the bay is to keep agricultural lands in agricultural use. Because as soon as those lands are non-economic for agriculture, they get converted. They get converted to parking lots and shopping malls and housing units. And per acre, there's a lot more stuff coming off the urban lands per acre than there are off agricultural lands. So ultimately, it's about the healthy watershed, the healthy resources of the bay, ultimately healthy waters here in Lake Erie. So thank you for being here today. I'm really proud of the partnership NRCS and all of you represent. We're hopeful that these additional resources are going to make a difference for water quality here for Lake Erie, but then also we're hopeful that the science we're bringing here to help with the conversation are going to help not just NRCS, but our partners in the Bay devise the strategies that are needed to help producers be excellent stewards of their lands, but also really ultimately excellent stewards of Lake Erie itself. So thank you.